So before we actually get into writing the container parsing code, I just want to take a look at a couple of the helper classes that we're going to use here. So we have an IOC exception class. So if there's any exception that gets thrown by the container, we'll catch that exception and wrap it inside our own IOC exception so that the application is aware that this has come from the IOC container. We have a loader class, and the job of the loader class is to load the configuration from the JSON file. So this is using things like an object mapper class to map JSON objects into Java objects and then load those up. The JSON config file that we saw looks like this. So this is an array of information about things to load, and each of these things we'll call a registration. So there's a registration class that the loader loads things into. So in the loader, we map through the configuration and pick out the objects. We parse the data from the JSON into a registration object, and we store this thing into the list of registrations. We return that list from this load configuration method. As well as a simple configuration with an abstract type mapping onto some concrete type, we'll also need to deal with more complex configuration where the type we are mapping to, let's say meeting in this case, takes multiple constructor parameters, some of which might be types that are registered inside the container, but some of which might be primitive types or maybe even string types. So we need to see how we build those objects as well. So here, for example, we have our meeting class with a meeting constructor, and that takes an iMeeting service, but it also takes a string. Now we've seen that to create an iMeeting service, we can also configure that inside our configuration JSON file, and that will map onto some type like a meeting service. But string isn't an abstract class. String is a concrete type. And the same will go for other primitive types as well. If we wanted to pass, say, an int or a double or a float to our constructor, we need a way of configuring that inside our JSON file as well. And the way we do that is by specifying the name of the constructor parameter and the value of that parameter when we pass it in. So as an example, here we have a class which has a stupidly long name just for testing purposes. And here's the constructor for that class. The key thing is that this constructor has two constructor parameters. It takes something of type logger and something of type string. And we need to configure that. So here in my configuration class, config.json, I have my type, so this silly name with the interface that maps to a silly name with the implementation. And then here we specify one of the constructor params. We specify the value param, and we actually give that the value of 23. So if I look back in the type itself, that's this constructor parameter here. As before, it gets the logger parameter from the fact that logger is also registered inside the container. So inside the configuration, we map logger to file logger. So the idea with the IOC container is that any types that are mapped inside the configuration file, it picks up from that configuration file. But things such as primitive types and strings, it will pick up from the constructor param. So here, this is the name of the value we pass into the constructor, and this is the value of that value we want to pass into that constructor. So just to recap, we have a loader that has a load configuration method. This load configuration method gets called and reads through our configuration file, which is a JSON file, that maps values from this file into a list of registrations. The registration class contains things like the type that we want to load up, the thing that we are mapping to, and then any information about this type, such as its constructor parameters.